Welcome to the quantum signal. Stop scrolling. This is the last moment you get to choose unconsciously, because once you hear this, something in you will recognize what you've been avoiding, and recognition doesn't ask permission to change you. Subscribe, like, and comment I'm here. This locks you into the message. You were about to leave, weren't you? Already half gone, already convincing yourself that this was just another title, another voice, another moment that could be postponed, dismissed, or replaced later. Yet something slowed you, something subtle and quiet that did not shout or beg but simply waited, because the truth does not chase the unready. It stands still and allows the unprepared to walk past. And Thoth knew this long before words were written, before temples were raised, before time learned how to count itself. He knew that the most powerful messages arrive without force, without spectacle, arriving instead as a pause in the mind, as a hesitation in the body, as that strange sensation that makes you stop scrolling even when nothing logical tells you to. And that is why you are here now, not because you were persuaded, but because something within you recognized something ancient speaking again. Thoth, keeper of the scales, scribe of the unseen, watcher between worlds, does not speak to crowds, he speaks to thresholds, to those standing unknowingly at the edge of a shift. And if you feel an odd pressure behind your eyes, a faint tightening in your chest, or the sensation that this moment matters more than it should, understand this. Those sensations are not emotions, they are signals, and signals are older than language. You have lived many lives pretending not to hear them, learning to ignore the quiet voice beneath the noise, training yourself to move quickly so you would not have to feel deeply. But even now, even after everything, the signal reached you, and that alone tells me more about you than you may yet know about yourself. Thoth once taught that wisdom does not arrive as information but as remembrance, and remembrance is rarely comfortable, because to remember is to realize that something was taken, misplaced, or buried, often by your own hand, in the name of survival, belonging, or safety. And the world you live in rewards forgetting far more than remembering, rewards speed over stillness, reaction over reflection, consumption over contemplation. Yet despite all of that, here you are, lingering in a moment that asks nothing of you except that you stay, and staying, in a world designed to keep you moving, is an act of quiet rebellion. The ancient texts did not describe awakening as light or bliss at first. They described it as disturbance, as dissonance, as the unsettling realization that the story you were given about yourself is incomplete. And Thoth warned that those closest to the truth would be tempted to turn away, not because the truth is frightening, but because it dissolves the illusion of certainty, and certainty is comforting even when it is false. You were taught to seek answers outside yourself, to trust systems, authorities, timelines, permissions, yet the wisdom Thoth preserved was dangerous precisely because it pointed inward, because it suggested that consciousness itself is a technology far older than any machine, and that the human mind, when aligned with truth, is capable of perceiving patterns that collapse deception instantly, which is why such alignment is discouraged, ridiculed, or drowned in distraction. Notice how often you are encouraged to react, but rarely invited to reflect. How silence is framed as emptiness rather than potential. How intuition is dismissed as fantasy unless it can be measured, sold, or controlled. And yet every major turning point in your life arrived not as a spreadsheet or statistic, but as a feeling you could not explain at the time, a pull you did not understand until long after it had already changed you. Thoth taught that the unready seek proof, while the ready recognize resonance, and resonance is what brought you here. Not belief, not faith, not coincidence, but recognition, the quiet click of something aligning, even if you cannot yet name what that something is. This message is not here to convince you of anything, it is here to remind you that you already know more than you have been allowed to remember, that your awareness has been shaped, narrowed, trained to focus on survival rather than meaning, urgency rather than depth, and yet awareness, once expanded even slightly, cannot return to its former shape without friction, without discomfort, without change. That is why skipping would have been easier, because staying means accepting that this moment marks a line, not a dramatic one, not a visible one, but a subtle internal threshold where you begin to notice what you previously ignored, where patterns emerge, where questions sharpen, where silence starts to speak louder than noise. Thoth did not promise comfort, he promised clarity, and clarity rearranges lives quietly, steadily, until one day you realize you are no longer who you were when you began listening. You may think you are simply watching a video, but attention is never neutral, and where attention rests, energy follows, and where energy flows, structures shift, and the ancient scribes understood this well enough to encode their teachings in myth and symbol so that only those willing to slow down would receive them. If you feel a sense of anticipation mixed with unease, understand that this is not fear, it is orientation, the internal compass recalibrating, because something in you recognizes that this is not entertainment, not background noise, not another voice competing for your time, but a mirror held at a specific angle, revealing something just out of your usual line of sight. Thoth once said that truth does not announce itself because it does not need followers, it needs witnesses, and witnesses are those who stay when leaving would. Be simpler. Those who listen when distraction is easier, those who allow themselves to feel the subtle gravity of meaning pulling them inward. And if you are still here now, still present, still reading, then whether you accept it or resist it, something has already begun, not because you were chosen, but because you chose even unknowingly to pause, and in that pause, the door did not open with sound or spectacle, it opened with recognition, and recognition, once felt, cannot be unfelt. Now that you have crossed this internal threshold, even if you do not consciously admit it, something subtle has already rearranged itself within you, because awareness, once invited in, does not politely wait for permission to change things. It begins quietly, reorganizing priorities, softening old certainties, loosening the grip of beliefs that once felt immovable. And Thoth understood this process well enough to warn that the most dangerous moment is not ignorance, but partial awakening. That space where you can sense the falseness of old structures yet have not fully released them, because it is there that resistance whispers most convincingly. You may feel an urge to rationalize what you are experiencing, to categorize it as imagination, coincidence, or psychological suggestion. And that impulse is not failure, it is conditioning, the mind attempting to preserve familiar boundaries, because dissolution of old frameworks feels like loss, even when what is lost was limiting you. Thoth taught that the mind is a gatekeeper, not an enemy, but it was never meant to rule alone, and when intellect is severed from intuition, knowledge becomes sterile, repetitive, endlessly self-referential, and this is why so much information today feels abundant yet hollow, plentiful yet unsatisfying, because it feeds the mind while starving the deeper intelligence that recognizes meaning beyond data. You were trained to consume answers quickly, to move from one conclusion to the next without lingering. In uncertainty, yet uncertainty is where transformation incubates. And Thoth preserved this knowing in symbols rather than statements, because symbols bypass resistance and speak directly to the subconscious, where real change occurs. Notice how this message does not tell you what to believe, does not ask you to adopt a doctrine or identity, because Thoth rejected followers and sought instead those capable of self-initiation, those who could stand alone without external validation, because truth that depends on approval is already compromised. If you feel a strange combination of empowerment and isolation beginning to surface, understand that this is natural, because awakening separates before it connects. It removes false alignment before revealing authentic resonance, and many turn back at this stage, not because the path is wrong, but because it requires releasing borrowed certainty in exchange for earned understanding. The ancient teachings warned that the world would grow louder as consciousness became rarer, that distraction would masquerade as freedom, that urgency would replace presence, and that many would mistake stimulation for meaning. Yet within that noise, a quiet signal would persist, calling not to the masses but to individuals at precise moments in their lives, moments when collapse and clarity stand close together. Perhaps you found this message during a period of questioning, fatigue, disillusionment, or subtle dissatisfaction you could not articulate, and if so, the timing is not accidental, because awareness does not awaken in comfort, it awakens in friction when the old narrative no longer fits, but the new one has not yet formed. Thoth spoke of this as the space between breaths, the interval where creation reorganizes itself, and he warned that those who rush to fill that space with noise will miss the message entirely, while those who remain present will feel something ancient stir, not as belief, but as recognition, a remembering that feels deeply personal yet strangely impersonal, as if it does not belong to you alone but moves through you. You may begin to notice patterns now, repetitions in your life that once felt random, themes that surface across relationships, work, desires, and disappointments, and this is not because they are new, but because perception has sharpened, and what was once background noise is becoming signal. Thoth taught that reality is not fixed but responsive, that consciousness is not a byproduct of matter but a participant in its organization, and while this idea threatens rigid systems of control, it empowers the individual in ways that cannot be easily regulated, which is why such understanding has always been hidden in plain sight, encoded rather than announced. Do not expect a dramatic revelation or sudden enlightenment, because those expectations are another form of distraction. Expect instead a gradual deepening, a subtle recalibration of what feels true, a growing intolerance for superficial explanations, a quiet pull toward depth, meaning, and coherence, even if you cannot yet define what those words mean for you personally. You may find yourself less interested in convincing others and more interested in understanding yourself, less reactive to noise and more attentive to silence, less attached to being right and more curious about what remains unseen. And these shifts may feel disorienting at first, because identity built on reaction struggles when reaction loses its grip. Thoth never promised that awakening would make life easier. He taught that it would make it clearer, and clarity reveals both beauty and responsibility, because once you see patterns, you can no longer pretend they are accidents, and once you recognize the signal, you cannot unhear it. If you feel a quiet resolve forming, not loud or dramatic but steady and grounded, understand that this is the beginning of alignment, the slow convergence of thought, intuition, and awareness into coherence. And coherence is power not because it dominates, but because it cannot be easily manipulated. This message ends not with an answer, but with an invitation you have already accepted by staying, an invitation to continue noticing, questioning, pausing, and listening beyond this moment. Because Thoth's wisdom was never meant to live in texts or voices, but in the awakened perception of those willing to carry it forward silently through how they see, choose, and exist in the world. And if you feel that something within you has shifted, even slightly, then the purpose has already been fulfilled, not because you were told what to think, but because you remembered how to listen. At some point, often without announcement, awareness stops feeling like a concept and starts behaving like a presence, something that accompanies you rather than entertains you, and this is where many misunderstand the process, because they expect awakening to feel extraordinary, when in truth it feels clarifying, grounding, almost ordinary in its steadiness. And Thoth taught that the highest forms of power are subtle precisely because they do not need to declare themselves. You may notice that certain conversations no longer hold your attention, that certain patterns feel transparent, that certain emotional reactions lose their intensity, not because you are becoming detached or indifferent, but because perception has widened, and when perception widens, fixation weakens. The world has not changed, but your relationship to it has, and that distinction is everything. Thoth warned that once perception shifts, life begins to test integration, not with grand trials, but with small, persistent moments where you are invited to respond rather than react, to choose coherence over habit, to align action with understanding, and these moments are easy to overlook because they arrive disguised as routine, irritation, delay, or disappointment. You may feel a growing sense of responsibility, not imposed from outside but arising naturally, because to see clearly is to recognize influence, and to recognize influence is to realize that your attention, words, and choices shape more than just your own experience. This realization can feel heavy at first, because the illusion of unconsciousness is light, but the weight you feel is not burden, it is gravity, the grounding force that allows something real to form. Thoth described this stage as embodiment, the moment when wisdom descends from abstraction into behavior, when knowing becomes visible not through proclamation but through consistency, and this is where many spiritual narratives fall apart, because it is easier to speak of truth than to live it quietly when no one is watching. You may feel less inclined to announce your insights or seek agreement because the need for validation fades as internal alignment strengthens, and this silence is often misinterpreted by others as withdrawal, arrogance, or distance, when in reality it is integration, the mind and awareness learning to move together rather than pulling in different directions. Thoth emphasized that true wisdom simplifies rather than complicates, that clarity reduces excess, that alignment removes unnecessary struggle, and if you notice a subtle shedding occurring in your life, habits dissolving, attachments loosening, identities softening, understand that this is not loss, but refinement. The ancient teachings never framed transformation as accumulation, they framed it as subtraction, the removal of distortion until what remains can function with precision, and precision is calm, not dramatic. You may also encounter resistance from the external world, not as direct opposition but as misunderstanding, subtle pressure to return to old rhythms, old fears, old urgencies, because coherence stands out in environments built on fragmentation, and systems unconsciously attempt to neutralize what they cannot easily absorb. Thoth warned not to mistake this resistance for failure, it is confirmation, because structures only push back against what carries the potential to move through them differently. At this stage, discernment sharpens, and you may feel less tolerant of manipulation, emotional theatrics, or hollow authority, not out of superiority but out of clarity, because once you see patterns, they lose their power to confuse you. This can feel isolating, but Thoth taught that solitude and loneliness are not the same, that solitude is alignment with self, while loneliness is disconnection from it, and alignment, even when quiet, generates a form of stability that does not depend on constant affirmation. You may begin to experience time differently, moments stretching or compressing based on presence rather than clocks, because attention alters perception, and perception alters experience, a principle the ancients understood long before it was studied or named. Thoth spoke of time not as a line but as a field responsive to awareness, and while this may sound abstract, you will feel it practically in the way rushed moments soften when you stay present, in the way clarity emerges when urgency dissolves. This chapter of the journey is not about seeking more messages, more confirmations, more voices. It is about trusting the signal you have already learned to recognize, about allowing understanding to express itself through how you move, speak, and choose, even when it would be easier to default to habit. If you feel a growing steadiness beneath uncertainty, a calm beneath complexity, a quiet confidence that does not need to announce itself, then you are not drifting. You are integrating, and integration is the stage most rarely discussed because it offers no spectacle, only depth. Thoth did not measure wisdom by how much one knew, but by how little one needed to prove, and if you sense a subtle closing of loops within you, Unresolved questions settling not because they were answered, but because they were understood differently. Then something essential has taken root. This is not an ending, but a stabilization. The moment where awareness stops expanding outward and begins anchoring inward, preparing you not to escape the world, but to move through it with coherence, precision, and quiet authority. And if you remain attentive, you will notice that life itself begins responding differently, not magically, but naturally, because alignment alters interaction, and interaction shapes reality. And Thoth's deepest teaching was never about gods or myths, but about this exact moment, when a human being becomes present enough to participate consciously in their own existence. What remains now is not another revelation, but a settling, a quiet certainty that does not demand explanation, because the work at this stage is no longer about seeking or questioning, but about inhabiting awareness fully, without performance, without urgency, without the need to define it for anyone else. Thoth taught that the final threshold is not crossed outward but inward. When perception becomes stable enough, that truth no longer feels like something you discover, but something you stand within, effortlessly, and from that position, confusion loses its grip and illusion loses its authority. You may notice that you no longer chase meaning, because meaning begins to reveal itself through ordinary moments, through restraint, through choice, through silence, and this is the mark of completion, not as an ending, but as a return to something you carried before you forgot how to listen. There is nothing you must do now, no role to assume, no message to spread, because wisdom that needs to announce itself has not yet matured, and Thoth valued those who could move through the world unseen, unprovoked, and undisturbed, carrying clarity without turning it into identity. If you feel calm where you once felt restless, observant where you once reacted, present where you once escaped, then the signal has integrated, and from here, life becomes less about resistance and more about alignment, less about control and more about precision. Remember this, the ones who truly awaken do not feel special, they feel responsible, not burdened, but aware of the weight of attention, the consequence of thought, the quiet influence of coherence, and that awareness will guide you more reliably than any voice ever could. Thoth does not follow you beyond this point, because he was never meant to lead, only to remind. And if you reach the end without feeling the need to rush away, then the reminder has already done its work, silently, permanently. And from this moment forward, you will notice what others pass by, not because you are different, but because you are present, and presence, once stabilized, does not fade. Now here's the question for you. What part of the country are you watching this story from? Drop your state in the comments below.